How's it going again, everybody? Brandon here. Going to take a look at this particular painting in this video. This is a foggy morning lake scene that was inspired by a picture that I took on a local lake here near my house, Lake Bowen. So we're going to now have a look at my process of painting this one. Let's go. So what I've got here is a 16 by 20 canvas that I'm going to be working on this particular project. I've got a reference photo. This is a photo I took out on a local lake here. The name of it is Lake Bowen here in Spartanburg. I took this one morning not too long after daylight. It was pretty foggy out there, so it was just a real foggy atmosphere with this distant tree line. And I thought this would make an interesting painting, so I'm going to try to give this thing a go. And I'm going to do something a little different. So it is a reference photo, yes, but I'm going to maybe tweak the colors just a little bit to make it not just quite gray all the time. I'm going to do something I haven't done before. I've got a whole bunch of this brilliant purple color, and I'm going to tone this canvas with this brilliant purple and maybe mix in a little bit of black into it to darken it in some areas, or even some white to thin it out in some areas. But I'm going to basically tone this whole canvas with this color first with just a large brush, just to give me something to work with. I think coming back and putting the fog and everything over it, just having some color down, is going to help me visualize what I'm trying to do. So I'm going to spray this canvas with a little bit of water just so this will move around a little better. And I'm going to put some of this purple on this canvas and see what happens. And I think the front corners down here need to be a little bit darker. So I'm going to add a little bit of black to the mix in that area. But for the most part, we're going to put a thin layer in here of this brilliant purple. And I'm going to do some of this mixing right here on the canvas. So down here in these corners, I'm going to touch in some black. Alright, I'm going to let this dry for a few minutes, and then we will revisit this and start building in our basic fog layers, I guess, with some lighter gray tones, and we'll just keep working on this until we get it looking the way we want to look. But for now, that is going to be my basic toning of my canvas with a little bit of color, some purple in there, just so I can have something to start with as opposed to that blank white canvas, which you probably could do if you want. But anyway, let's give this a few minutes to dry and we will pick back up. Alright, now that I've given this a few minutes to dry, this is just a really thin layer in there of paint, so you can still see some of the canvas coming through that, but that's okay. But this is dry now, so I'm going to get started. And first thing I'm going to do is basically lay in where my tree line is going to be. And that way, as I start putting these atmosphere and fog and stuff in here, it'll be okay if I actually layer that right over these tree lines to a certain extent, because that tree line needs to look like it's distant in the fog anyway. So I'm okay with bringing my fog layers of paint back over it. I just want to have a basic idea of where the tree line is going to land. So I am going to get a little bit of tiny bit of sap green and some black and a little bit of blue. now that I've got that roughly in place, it's going to be time to start bringing in some of this fog. So to do that, I am going to have to play around with some colors a little bit. I'm going to use a lot of titanium white, obviously, but I'm going to have just a touch of some ivory black in with this, and maybe a hint of that purple that we started with will come back into play as well. And we're going to see what kinds of values of colors I can get here. I don't want everything to be so monotone looking that it's just kind of a dull. I don't want a dull landscape out there, so I'm going to vary it up a bit. Now I essentially want to do the same thing for the water, but I want the water to be a far more consistent reflection color in terms of smoothness, I guess, horizontally, and then I will put the wave highlights in at the very end. Now, as this water is getting closer to us here in the foreground near the bottom, you're going to see a lot more of the color reflection in the face of the waves of just that dark colored water. So I'm actually going to put more of just a dark, basically that dark purple with that black mixed into that purple and some blue down here along what will be the face of some waves very much near us in the foreground here. There'll be a lot less of that highlight color right here in front of us. Alright, so I've now got a little bit of a start anyway of where we're headed with our foggy atmosphere and our water. This is again working in layers, so I've put in a layer of color now that I can turn around and start working in different fades and variations of color just to try to make things look a little interesting, make it look a little bit more like a foggy atmosphere. I can work on this tree line. But this is again, it's giving me at least a good starting point, so I always like to work in layers like that. If you've seen any of my other videos, that's pretty much what I do. So I'm going to give this just a minute to dry a little bit down here. So I'm going to go back up now to the sky and continue to work in up here, and all I'm going to do is essentially the same thing I just did, but it'll be adding another layer of it, so we'll get more complete coverage of color, and I can start to make some decisions on exactly how I want this to look in terms of, do I want some brighter areas where it looks like a little bit more of the sun or whatever's, you know, shining through, and keep some areas a little darker for a little bit more variety and effect. And this is really just completely random at this point. I mean, yeah, I have my reference photo that I took, but I'm not going to try to or emulate that exact look completely. I'm just using it for an idea of how I want this to go. But I don't want this painting to be quite so monotone looking in terms of, if you look at that photo, I mean, the entire sky and even the water reflections, for the most part, they all look very much the same color all the way across, same intensity. So there's not a lot of variation of what's going on, especially in the sky itself. And to me, I mean, that's okay. I'm just going to try to make my sky just a little bit more interesting by mixing that up a little bit, and we'll see what we get. I've got another pretty good layer of color put in here now, and I'm starting to kind of get a feel for how this is going to look and how that sky is going to come out, and maybe the reflections on the water a little bit too. So I'm going to start to work on this tree line again, and really all it is a matter of, to a certain degree, covering it all up, but then slowly putting it back where it looks like it is covered up in this fog. So I'm going to put basically a thin layer of some of this foggy atmosphere color over the top, especially the edges. And I'll have to do this in layers too, so this will have to dry, and then I'll have to come back with some more. And then ultimately, when it's all said and done, this will hopefully look like a distant tree line that's starting to show through the fog in some areas. Some of it will be further away than others, so some of it's going to barely be visible, and other parts of it you'll be able to see a little bit better. So we're going to start just by, like I said, essentially covering up what's there with a little bit of this atmosphere color, or this fog color, I should say. I know that a section of this tree line right here is going to be the most visible, so it will end up being the darkest section, making it appear closer. But that'll at least now get us started on our tree line in terms of getting it worked in the way we want. So this is basically now going to be a process of maybe one or two more layers of color in the sky. Once I get the sky basically the way I want it to look, then we'll come down here and change our highlights a little bit. So if we've got a brighter area in the sky, we'll have to add that brighter area in the water reflection. And we'll keep the reflection in the distance, essentially the lightest color, because it's going to be showing the most reflection way off there. As it gets closer to us, we'll darken it up a little bit. We'll put more of the face of waves in here that you're going to see this darker color up front. So I'm going to save the water, I think, for last. I'll get the sky finished first, along with that tree line. Once I'm pretty happy with that, we'll move on to the water. So for right now, I'm going to let this sit another minute or two to make sure that sky is good and dry, and then we'll come back with essentially a third layer pass of putting color in. Okay, this has been drying now for several minutes, and now I'm going to come back with a larger brush. I think this is a big 2-inch brush, to create a little bit more of uniformity in the sky in terms of the color and the fog itself, because the photo I'm using, obviously everything looks very, very monotone across there, and I don't want it to be quite like that, but I want to get rid of some of the noticeable changes and splotchiness that I've got going on with this base layer. So I'm going to come in with a larger brush to create a little bit more uniform look and try to meet it somewhere halfway in the middle. So at least that's my thought process. I'm going to use the larger brush just to cover more ground with the same color. I'm going to be using mostly still titanium white, but I'm going to put maybe just a shade of purple highlight in there. And see what we get with that. Yeah, that looks pretty good. Alright, well, that is at least getting me in the right direction that I want to be in now. It's a little bit more of a monotone looking foggy fade there. I still need to adjust these colors a little bit. So I'm going to come back in again with some more white. And a touch of black in there to gray that up a little bit. Well, so using the larger brush certainly accomplished most of what I was looking for, to try to make a little bit more uniformity across there, but I'm still playing around with these colors a little bit. I don't personally think that I want it to be quite that purple in there. I want it to be maybe a little more on the gray side of things. So I'm introducing a little more black into the mix to gray it out a little bit, and still working on getting these colors right. I'm going back to a little bit smaller brush. And again, just trying to get the color where I want it, and I'm not entirely sure in my head really what that is until I see it on the canvas, if that makes sense. Probably doesn't, but it's like I got to put it out here and then see what I end up with as a finished product. Okay, so I think I've gotten to a pretty good spot now with my sky part of the fog itself. I'm going to let that dry again. And I'm going to start to work on this tree line some more to where I can hopefully try to make it look like, you know, close to that reference photo there of a tree line that's back in the distance in the fog. Part of it's a little easier to see than others as it's closer to you. So I'm going to have to play around with that for a few minutes as well. And once I get that done, I'll start back on the water. For now, though, I think that I'm going to say that that's finished. I'm going to let it dry to make sure that it is what I want it to be, and go from there. So we'll see. So to get started back again on this tree line, really all I'm going to do initially is just ever so slightly darken up the mix that I've been doing with the fog. Darkening it up with a little bit of black. Alright, so that gives me a pretty good starting point again now with my tree line using the larger brush. So I'm going to switch to a much smaller one now and start to try to fine-tune this a bit. So it's if you look at the reference photo again, there's some areas in here that's a little closer, that's a little more visible to see, and then some areas that really start to fade out in the distance. So this is just going to be a matter of just kind of fine-tuning some of these colors and saturations. Alright, well, I'm at a pretty good point, I think, now with my tree line and my sky. I've let that dry a little bit, and I'm fairly happy with it, at least for now. That might be how I leave it, I don't know. But I'm going to get started on the water at this point, and once I get the water looking right, maybe I'll decide if I want to do anything else back there or not. But the water's going to take probably the most time to deal with, because I'm going to try to really create some ripples in here where the reflections look right. So on the tops of all these ripples, you're going to have the brighter reflection highlight from the sky, and on the face of all these ripples and waves will be darker. And so it's going to take a little bit of playing around, but we're going to get started in here and see what we come up with. Okay, so what I'm trying to do here now on these waves is I'm really having to concentrate on what these waves look like, you know, in terms of a photographic reference, and really focus on the highlight that is reflecting the sky that is on the tops of these waves, and then the darker areas that's here on the face of these waves, and then in the little nuances in between, and basically carry that pattern away from me, so make them smaller as they go away, and also take the tone down of these darks and lights as I go away to make it look like those waves are further in the distance. So I've got a few that you might even barely be able to make out on the video, areas of a little grayer tone and highlight back here to look like really distant waves. And then I'm going to try now to fine-tune these a little bit, but then move them methodically backwards as they get smaller and in less intensity to make it look like these waves are going further away in the distance. So it's going to be a little bit tricky. I haven't really done a lot of waves and ripples like this, so I just have to kind of figure it out again as I'm going. So again, you're going to see me a lot of back and forth between darks and lights here and working with these colors to try to make it look right, but we'll get going on that now, and I have moved to a smaller brush to try to help me out with this, so we'll see how it goes. Alright, well now I have a pretty good idea of where all of my individual little waves and ripples here are going to be. And so now comes the real time-consuming part of going into each one of these and trying to fine-tune and detail out the darks and the lights and the shadows and the tones to make them look as realistic as I can. And really, I mean, from about the midpoint of this water down, I think is where I'm going to really try to concentrate. As those ripples and waves get further off in the distance, you're not really going to be able to see much in terms of any kind of detail. So I'm going to try to concentrate from about the middle down and make these things look as realistic as I can. Okay, well, I'm kind of on the home stretch now, so to speak. Really, what I'm going to continue to do is keep working on these ripples and waves through this kind of midsection here, and then clean up this area of the water back there. Probably try to bring in a little bit more of that foggy atmosphere down over the water, one way or another. And then just, you know, take a step back and look at it and see what else I want to try to change. So that's all I'm really going to do at this point, is continue working on these waves and these ripples. And the main thing is trying to get, you know, the shapes of the waves looking realistic, or at least as realistic as I can get them at this point, with the darker color towards the peak of the face of the wave, the lighter colors on the top of the reflection of the sky, and just a process of going across the canvas here and working on each one. So what we're going to continue with. Well, at this point, it's one of those things that I could sit here and play around with and keep manipulating and adjusting probably forever. So I'm just going to get to a stopping point here and say this piece is finished. So hopefully some of you guys liked that. This is again a foggy atmospheric scene inspired by a photo I took one morning out on Lake Bowen near my house. Obviously I just used the reference photo as kind of the inspiration. I didn't follow it exactly in terms of how everything looked. The water in the photo was a good bit different because I was physically moving in my boat when I took it, so it was just kind of a streaky looking water down there. I definitely wanted to change that up. But I am going to put a signature on this and say that it's finished. So hope you guys liked it, and we will see you again on the next one.